All right, students, this is chapter 2, all about the motherboard. Here's the objectives for this chapter. Motherboard types and features. Motherboard are the most complicated computer component. One of the first items to consider when building a computer. Consider the following when you're purchasing a motherboard. The form factor, which means the size, right? Processors, socket, and chipset. Expansion slots, other connectors, slots, and ports. Oop. Here's the Asus Prime Z37P gaming motherboard, which uses the ATX form factor. Motherboard form factor determines the motherboard size and features that make it compatible with power supplies and cases. Most popular are the ATX, the Micro ATX, and the Mini ITX. Mini ITX is smaller than Micro ATX and is also known as MITX. Following slide shows examples of form factors and comparisons of size and hold positions of several form factors. This is the Intel M-ATX form factor and uses the processor, cooler, and memory modules installed. See, here's your conventional CPU, CPI slots, 2 PCIe expansion, right here. Cooler with the heatsink and the CPU is below. Full memory DIMMs. Here is your, this is the main power connector. Another heatsink cheap chipset underneath that. Here's your mini ITX motherboard, right, for even smaller computers. Here's form factor. Here's a chart. Form factor, motherboard slides, and description. Here's the size and hold positions for the ATX, micro ATX, and mini. This is where you screw it onto the case. Intel and ADM chipsets and processor sockets. A chipset is a set of chips on the motherboard that works closely with the processors to control the memory, buses on the motherboard, and some peripherals. Must be compatible with the processors it serves. A socket is a rectangular with pins or pads to connect the processor to the motherboard. Two major chipset processor manufacturers, Intel and AMD. Intel chipsets, the names are Coffee Lake, Kaby Lake, and Skylake, Broadwell, and Haswell. Since the release of the second generation of Intel family of processors, you can know which generation of processor fits by the 4 digits in the model number. Example, Core i5 6200U processor is a 6th generation processor. Here's an 8th generation LGA 1151 socket with the cover removed and the loaded plate lifted, ready to receive the processor. Remember I talked about ZIF? This is the ZIF right here. So what you do is you basically plop it, right, into place, and then you take this and you lock it. That holds it in place. Sockets for Intel, current Intel sockets for desktop computers are these, and Intel sockets used for server and high-end performance are these. Most likely to tell the difference between an Intel and an AMD, Intel has 4 letters on this socket. There's 4 numbers on the sockets. That's how you can tell which is Intel and which is AMD. Here's the 7th and 6th generation LGA. Here's the ZIF again. Right, socket at the bottom of an Intel processor. The LGA 1366 socket with the socket cover removed. Hold the plate, and it's ready to receive the processor. ZIF, this is the ZIF right here, I think it's, here it is right there. That's the ZIF. ZIF stands for Zero Insertion Force. Sockets are used to lift the processor out of the socket using this lever or locking them in place. AMD chipset and sockets. Current AMD chipset and socket categories for personal computers. Here are the different ones. As you can see, they're different from Intel. Intel is their 4 numbers. It's Intel. Anything else is going to be AMD. Match a processor to the socket in the motherboard. You must pay close attention to the actual model number of the processor to know which socket is required and which motherboard can support it. The motherboard's manufacturer manual is your Bible for your computer. To match a processor to a motherboard and socket, look at the motherboard manufacturer's website or user guide for a list of processors the motherboard supports. You can also search Intel or AMD websites for the exact processors to make sure the socket it is using is the same as the socket on the motherboard. Base and expansion slots, fine lines found on both the top and the bottom of the motherboards are called traces. Traces are circuits or paths that enable data instructions, timing signals, and power to move component to component on the board. The bus is system of pathways used for communication and the protocol and methods used for transmission. A protocol is a set of rules and standards that any two entities use for communication. Here's the bottom of the motherboard. On the bottom of the motherboard, you can see the bus lines terminating to the processor socket. PCI Express comes in 4 different slot sizes called PCIe, called PCI Express, X1, 4, 8, and 16. The number after the X refers to the number of lanes available for data. Example, PCIe X4 contains 4 lanes. PCIe X16 slot is used by graphics cards that require large throughput. To provide extra wattage required for the cards, the card may have 1, 2, or 3 connectors to connect the card to the extra power. Here's the 3 types of expansion: PCI X1, 16, and your conventional PCI. PCI documentation for one motherboard. Auxiliary power connector to support the PCIe. This is Molex, and this is the SATA style. PCI conventional PCI slots and buses are slower than those of PCIe. Slots are slightly taller than PCIe slots. Transmit 32 data bits in parallel and operates at about 500 megabits per second. Used for all types of add-on cards. Riser cards is used to extend the slots. A low profile or slimline case may not give you enough room to install an expansion card standing up in the slot. A riser card installs the slot and provides another angle. A riser is out. You have a picture in the next slide. Riser cards come in all types of PCI and PCIe slots. Here's an example, right? Let's say you can put this on the motherboard, and then you could put here on the side. So if I'm using Paint, right? If this is a computer case, a riser will be here, and then you will put the whatever peripheral here on the side. That's if you don't have a lot of space on your motherboard. You can do that. Riser cards. Outboard ports or integrated components. Ports coming directly off the motherboard may include USB, PS2, mouse and keyboard, video sound network, eSATA ports, input-output shield plate installed in the computer, providing holes for input-output ports, your internal connector, USB, M.2, SATA, and IDE connectors. Here it is, right? DVI, USB, HDMI, etc., etc. Here's the I/O shield that you can put over this. SATA, Serial Advancement Technology Attachment, or Serial ATA, an interface standard used by most storage devices. The current version of SATA, you have SATA Express, SATA 2 and 3, M.2, formerly known as Next Generation Form Factor, uses PCIe, USB, or SATA interface to connect a mini add-on card, commonly used by wireless and solid state. Here's a M.2 slot. An M.2 slot is keyed with a notch to hold the M.2 card with a B or M key edge connector. IDE is your older used to interface storage devices with the motherboard. IDE has connector has 40 pins. USB headers used to connect the cable from the motherboard to USB on the front of the computer case. This is an IDE connector. This is the older one. You would use this type of cable called a parallel cable to connect one side to here and the other side to your hard drive or DVD. Here are your USB connectors. Firmware on the motherboard is used to enable or disable connector, port, or component, control the frequency and other features of the CPU, manage security features, control what happens when the computer first boots, monitor and log various activity of the board. Motherboard made after 2012 uses BIOS UEFI firmware. Prior to 2012, motherboard only used BIOS. UEFI improves on BIOS, but also includes BIOS for backward compatibility with older devices. Facts about UEFI. Microsoft requires UEFI in order for systems to be certified for Windows 10 and 8. UEFI is required for hard drives larger than 2 terabytes. UEFI offers secure boot, which prevents the system from booting up with drivers or an OD that is not digitally signed and trusted by the motherboard or computer manufacturer. For backward compatibility, UEFI can boot from a master boot record hard drive and provide BIOS boot through compatibility support module features. How do you access the BIOS UEFI setup program? Access to it can be done by pressing a key or a combination of keys during the boot process. For most motherboard, press F12, F2, or delete during the boot. See documentation or watch the screen in the beginning of the boot. Setup screen appears with menus and help features. This is what it looks like for old BIOS. This is what it looks like for the modern UEFI. Changing the boot option in the BIOS UEFI setup boot menu, you can set the order in which the system tries to boot from certain devices. It's called the boot priority or the boot sequence order. Boot priority order. Examples when you might need to change the boot order. Some distributions of Linux can be installed on a USB flash drive, so you can boot the OS from the drive when you put the USB device first in the boot priority order. When installing an OS on a hard drive, you might want BIOS UEFI to first boot from a DVD to install from a setup DVD. If you're installing an OS from a server, put the PCI LAN EFI network option at the top of the boot priority and enable Pixie boot to LAN, boot from the Windows setup DVD to troubleshoot a computer that will not start. Manage Secure Boot. Secure Boot was invented to help prevent malware from launching before the OS and the anti-malware software are launched. Secure Boots only works when the boot mode is UEFI and the OS supports it. Supported by Windows 10 and several distributions of Linux. Secure Boots holds digital signatures, encryption keys, and drivers and database stored in flash memory on the motherboard and or the hard drive. When enabled, it checks each driver, DOS, and applications before the UEFI launches these programs to verify It's signed and identified in Secure Boot database. Manage Secure Boot on the security screen on the BIOS UEFI. Right, you see how there it's enabled. You could disable it if you need to. Manage CSM and UEFI boot. The boot screen allows you to select UEFI mode of CSM mode. UEFI mode is required for secure boot to be enabled. Use CSM for backward compatibility with older BIOS and drivers and MBR hard drives. Use CSM to boot legacy BIOS here. You can enable or disable some onboard devices using BIOS UEFI setup. For example, network ports, USB, and video ports. What you can configure on your system depends on the onboard device the manufacturer offers. Overclocking, running a processor, memory, motherboard, or video card at higher speed than the manufacturer recommended. Who likes to do this? Gamers. Some motherboards and processors allow overclocking, but it is not recommended best practice. You're going to overheat your equipment unless you're using liquid cooling. And here is where you can enable and disable your devices. Other security features besides Secure Boot: power on password, low jack, drive password protection, TPM, chip and drive encryption. Power on passwords, this used to be done years ago. Power on passwords are assigned in BIOS UEFI setup to prevent unauthorized access to the computer and or the BIOS UEFI setup utility. Depending on the motherboard, it may be possible to set up a user and a supervisor password. How to set up passwords varies depending on the motherboard and the BIOS, but it usually looks like this, right? If you set up a user password, you can, as soon as you turn on the computer, it's going to pop up and you have to put in your password. If you want to go into the BIOS, both user and supervisor password will get you into the BIOS, but only the supervisor will let you make any changes. Low jack for laptops. I don't know if you remember that, right? They have low jack. You used to have low jacks in cars, but they don't really steal cars nowadays, so it's not really dependent as much as before. Low jack and CompuTrace agent technologies are embedded in the firmware on many laptops to protect the system against theft. Must subscribe to the service. The service can be used to locate a laptop whenever it's connected to the internet. Once located, you can give commands through the internet to lock the laptop or delete all data on it. Driven password protection. Some motherboards allow you to set a password in order to access the hard drive. Does not encrypt all the data on the drive, but only encrypts a few organizational sectors. The TPM, or the Trusted Platform Module, and hard drive encryption. Many motherboards contain a chip called the TPM chip. The BitLocker encryption tool in Windows 10, 8, and 7 works with this chip. An encryption key or startup key is kept on the chip. Assures that you cannot take the hard drive out of one computer and put it in the other if you have BitLocker encryption turned on. Can be used with other encryption software that may be installed on the hard drive other than BitLocker. If the motherboard fails and is replaced, you will need a backup copy of the startup key. So make sure that you save it in a good place, right? Because if it's encrypted and you don't have the key, that's it. All right, BIOS support for virtualization. Virtualization is when one physical computer uses software to create multiple virtual computers. A virtual machine simulates the hardware of a physical computer. Each VM works like a physical computer and is assigned virtual devices such as a virtual motherboard and a virtual hard drive. Virtualization must be enabled in the BIOS UEFI setup. When you finish with the BIOS UEFI setup, an exit screen will give you various options such as saving your changes and exiting, or discarding your changes and exiting. Some offer the option to load optimize defaults. This option can sometimes solve a problem when a user has made inappropriate changes to BIOS UEFI setup settings, or you're attempting to recover from an error creating while updating the firmware. Here's the setup screen or the exit screen. Updating motherboard drivers and BIOS UEFI. When the motherboard is causing problems, you may want to use a new OS or hardware device. You might need to update the motherboard drivers or update the BIOS UEFI firmware. Both skills are covered. Device drivers are small programs that allow the software to interact with the hardware. The CD or DVD comes with the motherboard contains a user guide and drivers for its onboard component. After installing a motherboard, you can install the drivers from the CD or DVD and later update them by downloading updates from the motherboard's manufacturer's website. Some updates are included in updates to Windows, like Dell. This computer is a Dell computer, and it updates when I update my Windows. The other day I updated it, and it asked me to download a new firmware for BIOS UEFI. Be sure you are connected. You get the correct drivers for the OS edition and type. So, for example, Windows 10 64-bit, you are using with the board. This is where you download drivers and utilities from the website. But I have a Dell and it does it automatically. Updating firmware, the process of upgrading or refreshing the program and data stored on a firmware chip is called updating firmware, or flashing BIOS UEFI, or flashing BIOS. Reasons to flash the BIOS: the system hangs at odd times during boot. Some motherboard functions have stopped working or are causing problems. You get errors when you try to install a new OS or hardware device, and you want to incorporate some new features or new component on the board. To flash the BIOS UEFI, always follow the directions found in the user's guide for your motherboard. Motherboard can use one or more of these methods. Download and update from within BIOS UEFI. Update from a USB flash drive using BIOS UEFI setup. Run an express BIOS UEFI update. Cautions to be aware when updating: don't update a firmware without a good reason. Back up first. They're always going to tell you that. Select the correct update file and don't interrupt the update, i.e., don't shut it off. Let it run and complete. A jumper is two small posts or metal pins that stick up off the motherboard, that is used to hold configuration information. Open jumper has no cover, and a closed jumper has a cover on the two pins. Jumpers can be used, for example, to clear a forgotten password or power on password. If flashing the BIOS UEFI fails, a jumper can be set to undo the update. Here's the little jumpers right here. Right, these are not covered. And here's your jumper position. Right, normal, configure, or recovery. So that means you can put, for normal, it's on pin 1 and 2. To configure, you put 2 and 3, and for recovery, no pin at all. CMOS, or replacing the CMOS battery, is a method of manufacturing microchips. CMOS RAM is a small amount of memory stored on the motherboard that retains data even when the computer is turned off, i.e., like the time and date. It is charged by a nearby lithium coin cell battery. To replace the CMOS battery, choose the correct replacement battery. They usually, those 2032 batteries, usually those. Must be an exact match to the original or the manufacturer's recommendation. Power down the system, unplug it, press the power button to drain the power. Remove the case cover. Use, again, wrist strap. Remove the old battery using a flathead screwdriver and pop a new one into place. Installing or replacing a motherboard. A motherboard is considered a field replaceable unit. A technician needs to know how to select an appropriate motherboard and install or replace one in a desktop or laptop. The three approaches to selecting a motherboard. Since the board that provides the most room, select the board that provides the most room for expansion. So you can upgrade and exchange components and add devices easy. Select the board that best suits the need of the computer current configuration. Select the motherboard that meets your present needs with moderate room for expansion. Ask the following questions when selecting a motherboard. How is the motherboard to be used? What form factor does the motherboard use? Which brand, Intel or AMD, and model processor does the board support? Which chipset does it use? Which processor does it support? Which type of speed of which type and speed of memory does the board support? Ask the following questions when selecting a motherboard. What are the embedded expansion slots, internal and external connections, and devices on the board? Does the board fit the case? Right? What if it doesn't fit? What are the price and the warranty on the board? Does the board get good reviews? How extensive and user-friendly is the documentation? And how helpful is the manufacturer's website? I know a lot of people don't like Dell, but Dell has good stuff as far as support. What warranty and how much support does the manufacturer supply for the board? How to install or replace the motherboard. General purpose for process for replacing a motherboard. Verify the right motherboard is selected. Get familiar with documentation, features, and settings. Remove components to reach the old motherboard. Install the I/O shield. Install the motherboard. Install the processor and the processor cooler. Install the RAM. Attach the cabling, case switch, power supply, drivers. Install the video card on the motherboard. Plug the computer into power source. Attach the monitor, keyboard, and mouse. Boot the system and enter UEFI BIOS setup. Observe post. Make sure you don't get any errors. Verify that Windows starts with no errors. Install the motherboard drivers. Install other expansion cards and drivers. Verify that the system is operating properly. Make the final OS and BIOS UEFI adjustment. Example, setting power on passwords. And that's it. Now, replacing a laptop system board. When replacing the motherboard on a laptop, you may need to fully disassemble the entire laptop. Consider alternatives before proceeding. General procedures for replacing the motherboard. Update Windows and device drivers and make sure Windows is working properly. Disconnect the AC adapter and press function plus S plus V to set up the battery in ship mode. Remove the hard drive slot compartment cover and the hard drive. Next, remove the slot compartment cover that gives access to memory and the mini PCIe card and remove those two components. Remove the keyboard bezel. Remove the 13 screws. Detach the touchpad and keyboard ribbons from the two flexible printed circuit connectors. It's a lot of work for the laptop. Uh, to detach the system board, remove the 5 screws holding it in place, and then remove the 6 ribbon cables connecting the speakers, hard drive, optical drive, USB ports, battery, camera, and LCD panel. Then follow the directions in reverse order to reassemble. Then you take it out. This is a lot of work for a laptop. If you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. And that's it for chapter 2. So after you finish reading and listening, you can go on and do the quiz for chapter 2.